On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. Already shots had been fired in a war between the colonists and the British military. Congress outlined the cause of this rupture, a long train of abuses and usurpations. The colonists had been denied their rights, some as important as the right to a fair trial, the right to a jury by their peers, the dissolving of legislative bodies elected by the people, and perhaps least importantly, the imposition of taxes without representation. In response to those violations, the colonists had petitioned for redress of grievances, but these attempts were ignored by the king and Parliament. Instead, the leadership of Great Britain demanded the submission of the colonies and sent an armed force to subjugate the people. Conflict ensued. While much debate can be had over the question of whether or not this chain of events was necessary, whether the issues could have been resolved short of war, what happened as a consequence was truly one of the most powerful events in the history of the world. Thomas Jefferson and a committee of 4 others wrote a stunning document, and using ideas which came from the Bible, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment, made their bold statement which has changed the world. Within a few weeks, the words which have resounded through the halls of history were read in the camps of revolutionary soldiers and in town squares across the new nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They held that if government became obstructive of those ends, then the people had the right to throw off the old government and establish a new government. This remains perhaps the strongest expression of the United States' ideal character. It is true, however, and unfortunately, that some of the signers of that declaration, even its author, owned slaves. Slave owners were also among those who wrote the Constitution, and under the 3/5 Compromise they recognized the legitimacy of the peculiar institution. For these reasons, slavery has been rightly called by historians America's original sin. Those who study history must note that from the beginning there was great tension between the founding ideals and the existence of slavery, in spite of them. Jefferson said slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears. You don't like it, but you can't let go. Patrick Henry remarked that his slave owning was in contradiction to his own religious beliefs. He could not, he said, justify it. Others among the founders condemned the institution, recognizing a need for its end. Benjamin Franklin participated in the founding of the first abolition society in the nation. Weeks after the Declaration, a preacher named Lemuel Haynes, one of thousands of black patriots who fought in the Revolution, spoke powerfully on the extension of those ideals and the hypocrisy of the nation. Therefore, we may conclude that liberty is equally as precious to a black man as it is to a white one, and bondage equally as intolerable to the one as it is to the other. I think it is very obvious from what I have humbly offered that so far forth as you have been concerned with the slave trade, so far it is that you have assumed an oppressive and tyrannic power. Therefore, is it not high time to undo these heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free? And while you manifest such a noble and magnanimous spirit, to maintain inviolably your own natural rights and militate so much against despotism as it hath respect unto yourselves, you do not assume the same usurpations and are no less tyrannic. Pray let there be a congruity amidst your conduct. The immoral institution of slavery persisted in a land whose founding principles called for liberty. But one should not fail to note that July 4th, 1776, heralded the end of the institution which had existed in the colonies for nigh on 200 years, and which had existed in the world since time immemorial. By 1800, all but the southern states had manumitted their slaves, and the transatlantic slave trade ended in 1808. Powerful voices like that of Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Martin Delany, and Harriet Beecher Stowe condemned slavery in the South and called for its end. And the abolition movement divided the country. The Civil War broke the nation in two, and at last opportunity arose to bring slavery to its end. On September 22, 1862, Abraham Lincoln gave the Emancipation Proclamation, which effectively turned the war into a crusade against slavery. Though it is certainly untrue that every Union soldier fought for slave liberation, many thousands, including around 200,000 African Americans, fought to free their brothers and sisters in the South. Hence the words of the battle hymn, "In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, for God is marching on." The war continued to rage. On June 19th of 1865, Union General Gordon Granger proclaimed freedom for the last enslaved people in Galveston, Texas. On December 16th of that year, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in this nation. This was, as Lincoln called it, a rebirth of freedom. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln implies that the bloodshed of 600,000 Americans in the terrible throes of the Civil War represented God's judgment for the blood drawn by the lash of slavery. He called for a just and lasting peace among ourselves. The end of the Civil War and the freeing of African Americans in bondage marked a turning point in the history of the United States. Certainly, though, the struggle was not over, for ever since the Revolution, men and women fighting for justice and equality have looked back to those founding ideals. Dr. King described them as a promissory note, yet to be delivered. He prayed for the day in which white children, black children, and children of every other color, ethnicity, and creed could hold hands and fellowship together. He dreamed of a future in which freedom would ring from the molehills of Alabama to Stone Mountain of Georgia. And today, Juneteenth, the abolition of slavery is celebrated in the city of Stone Mountain. Today, African Americans can stand together with white Americans on the summit of the mountain atop the last remains of a crumbling Confederate monument. Certainly, it is fair to have an argument whether or not such symbols should remain, but there is a delicious irony in the picture described. Make no mistake, the fight for justice has not ended, nor will it ever, for evil is oft reborn, and we live in a corrupt world. One must fight against evil actively, or else evil prevails. Today on June 19th and in a few weeks on July 4th, we celebrate the cause of liberty and its need for rebirth. Let us commit ourselves each day to those founding principles of liberty and justice for all. Let us seek to end divisions with understanding and set aside selfish desires so we can serve others. May the conclusion of Lincoln's inaugural address be our hope and pursuit. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and for his orphan, to do all which may achieve a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations.